Welcome to this episode of The Wolf and the Shepherd. Today we have with us Juan Marcos Bejarano Gutierrez. How'd I do, Juan?
That's very good, very good.
Okay, good. I was really sweating that. I mean, I do pretty good with at least Spanish pronunciation of names because, we are here in Texas and we have a very big Spanish population. So you got to kind of know how to do that. And our apologies to Toril a long time ago from Sweden. We butchered her name, but Juan, we got your name right. So, or at least Texan right. Let's go with that. So, hey, glad you could join us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It sounds like an exciting show, and I'm very happy to be here with you.
Now, Juan, I did want to wish you a happy new year, but I'm not sure if I should. What is the Jewish New Year? Because we've heard of it, but we don't really know why it's different than the regular kind of Roman calendar. And I guess it's this time of year when people think about the difference in holidays, Hanukkah and, Christmas. And then we get to New Year and people are kind of like, well, do you wish Jewish people a happy New Year? What do you say? So can you kind of just explain that little myth?
Sure. So it's interesting because there's something called the Mishnah. It's a Hebrew word, of course, and the Mishnah is part of something we call the oral law. And the oral law in a particular section tells us that there were actually 4 Jewish New Years. One of them was related to the agricultural calendar. One of them was related to the crowning of a new king. There were other New Years that were tied to different events in the life cycle of the people of Israel. And so the one that's most famous nowadays is Rosh Hashanah. That's what people think about. It's usually like in September, October, and that's Rosh is the head and Hashanah is the year. So it's the head of the new year. And there are different Jewish perspectives on it, but basically it's essentially like the birthday of the world, that God created, the heavens and the earth, and he's created mankind in that process. So that's really the new year that people think about. There are other New Years, for example, Passover, which is another very important holiday that takes place like in the springtime. So that's a separate one. We don't really think about that in the same way anymore. But yeah, you can certainly say Happy New Year to any Jewish person, and I'm sure they'll be happy to receive that. So.
Very cool. Very cool. So I'm sure there's probably a bunch of people right now that are saying, okay, well, as y'all typically start out the show, why are you asking this guy about Jewish New Year? So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're actually qualified very well to answer that question?
Okay, well, absolutely. So by day, I'm an engineer. I studied at the University of Texas at Dallas, in the Dallas area, native to Dallas. But at night, for about 15 years, I spent my free time studying in 3 different Jewish institutions. I went to a college called the Siegal College of Judaic Studies that was based in Cleveland, and I got a master's degree in Jewish studies. And then I continued my studies at the Spertus Institute for Jewish Learning and Leadership in Chicago, and I completed a doctorate in Jewish studies. And then in the midst of that, while in the program in Chicago, I found what's called the Smicha program. It's like a rabbinical ordination. You can think of like a pastor getting ordained or something, or a priest. So they had a program that was available for me in New York, and I was able to participate in that and receive rabbinic ordination. And today, I still have my engineering job, but I'm the rabbi of 2 small communities in the Dallas area. Very small, between the 2 of them, there's about 60 people, and we meet in homes, but we have all the elements of a regular synagogue. We just don't pay for a building. We meet in homes. We have all the things that we need for that: Torah, scrolls, everything that's related to synagogue worship. And of course, I write and I teach on various Jewish topics. So it can be Jewish history. It can be the liturgy of the synagogue. It can be topics as Jewish Christian relationships, anything like that. Anything to do that with Judaism is something that I teach. And sometimes, I have a lot of conversations with Christians, especially in the Dallas area. Of course, it's a very prominent area for many churches. So I'm very interested in that because I want there to be good relationships between Jews and Christians. And unfortunately, Jews and Christians have had a very complicated relationship throughout much of history. So that's an area that I'm particularly passionate about, and that is to educate and to foster a better understanding between, different religious communities.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I mean, you know, what do they call it? The Bible Belt down here, right? And of course,
Yes.
Bible meaning Old and New Testament and all that good stuff. So when you start these Jewish studies, and were you going in that knowing that you were going to, become a rabbi? Were you already kind of looking at that and saying, how do I become a rabbi? And maybe this is a good way for me to get started? Or did that just kind of happen along the way and you said, hey, this is the way I want to go. How do I become a rabbi? Oh, here's this program over here. That's what I'm going to do.
Well, I wanted to become a rabbi when I was in my undergraduate studies at the University of Texas at Dallas. So I was studying engineering, and I really wanted to become a full-time rabbi or a full-time professor in Jewish studies. But I was sort of thinking, it's not simple. There aren't that many congregations and synagogues available. For example, you mentioned the Bible Belt. I think in Dallas proper, there's something like 1,500 churches of all different types. And in the synagogue in Dallas, there's probably something like maybe 30 synagogues tops. And a lot of those are very small, just like, the ones that I'm the rabbi of. So you're talking about a very, just a very different community, much smaller. And so the idea of having a full-time position is not going to be very likely. And I also think philosophically that a person who is a leader of a religious community, ideally, they should have a full-time job, or they should have some kind of a connection to, shall we say, real life, because it's easy for somebody who's a rabbi to tell people, oh, you need to do this and this. It's different when you're working a full-time job, you're taking care of your family, and you're also involved in religious life, because you realize that there are a lot of requirements. We have dietary laws, we have intimacy, laws, between a husband and wife. We don't do certain things on Shabbat, on the Sabbath. There's a lot of things, prayers that we do every day. There's a lot of things that are involved. So I think it almost keeps you very centered to have a real life, real profession. And then on top of that, you're also serving as a religious leader. So at the time I said, well, it's not realistic for me to do this full time. I need to have my own career so that I'm not dependent upon a synagogue paying me. Because I think in some sense there's a little bit of a compromise that takes place there. If you're worried about losing members because you might say something that's politically incorrect, you might hedge your bets, not say what you want to say, or what Jewish law requires, or whatever it may be. And so what I decided was I would look for the programs that would be that would fit my schedule. And so that's why it took me 15 years to do the doctorate and the master's and the rabbinical ordination, because it was a very slow process, and I'd have to travel. I would go to Chicago for a week. I would come back. I would do my research papers. I would study. I would go back. I mean, it was a very arduous process, but it was also very, I think in many ways, exciting. I wasn't married. It kept me off the streets. I tell people, kept me out of gangs, that kind of thing. And so it was like a long-term vision, and it sort of finally came together. And what was interesting for me is that I got married late in life. I got married in 2011. And so the day that I got married, one of the rabbis from the rabbinical program from the yeshiva that I was studying at, they flew down, they did the marriage service for me. And then they also gave me my ordination the same day, so it was like a very meaningful, because I was married, and then I was also completing that particular phase of study. So it was just like a perfect starting point. And then my wife has been like a perfect partner in that sense. She's very committed to helping people in the synagogue. And she has I would say like a complementary role. She counsels people, she teaches, things of that nature. So it was just like the perfect pairing of the two, perspectives and of the roles. So yeah, it was a long-term approach, but I think it was the right one for me.
Right. Now, the first time I think I was introduced to the word rabbi was in Sunday school when I was about 6, and I misheard the word as rabbit, which kind of threw off my whole concept.
That's how the British say it, though, probably.
That threw off what I thought, rabbi probably was for a long period of time. But it kind of struck me, when you and I first started emailing each other, that I still really didn't understand what a rabbi was. I've seen the stereotypes on TV, and unfortunately the Jewish faith seems to be something which, regardless of the current era of political correctness, they still feel like they can heavily stereotype the Jewish religion on TV with really no comeback to it. So could you explain to our listening audience exactly what a rabbi is?
Yes. I wanted to mention something that I thought would be interesting for you, especially. There was a very famous rabbi who passed away last year. His name was Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, and he was the chief rabbi of Britain. And he was very well known in the United States, very elegant British accent, very impressive. It just shows you like the diversity of the Jewish community in all these places. And then I wanted to mention one more thing before I go into the rabbi explanation. I think one of the reasons that I have a lot of interest in England is because centuries ago, there were Spanish and Portuguese Jews in the Iberian Peninsula. And many of them, in fact, my ancestors were forced to convert to Catholicism, to Christianity under duress. And many of them eventually escaped the peninsula and the Inquisition. And some of them made it into cities like Amsterdam, some made it into London, and to other reaches of Western Europe. And so even today, there are synagogues in London that are, if you look at the subtitle or the description of the synagogue, they'll be the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue. And I was looking at a document yesterday, which I thought was very interesting. It was a document written in Spanish in 1776, and it was praying for King George III because he was at war with the colonies. And the synagogue was composed of Spanish-Portuguese Jews in London, were praying for the welfare of the British Empire. And then across in the United States, or the colonies at the time, there were Spanish and Portuguese synagogues in the Northeast, like in New York and in New Jersey. And they were praying for the colonies to be independent of the British Empire. So it's just sort of an interesting connection, the Britain and Spanish and Jewish and all these kinds of things. But to get to your point, the rabbis on a practical sense are they're judges, they're adjudicators. The rabbi can mean teacher or great one, like in someone who's exalted, but it's really a person who is a teacher. And in many ways, they have like many different functions. When the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in the 1st century, so we're talking about 70 CE, the priests were really the most important people there. That we call them the Kohanim. They were the ones who were doing the sacrifices. They were the ones that were in charge of the temple. And I mean, if you're familiar with the New Testament, for example, you hear a lot about the Levites and the priest. But it also mentions that there were Torah teachers, might use the term rabbis. So that concept was already there. And these individuals were teaching how to keep the Torah, how to keep the 5 books of Moses on a practical level. Because the Torah, these 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, it's almost like the Constitution. You need like a legislature to put it into practical observance, right? Nobody rules by the Constitution of the United States on a practical level. You have to go to the Texas state legislature. They pass laws. They say, well, this is constitutional, this is not. So in the same way, the rabbis and the priests as well, they would say, well, okay, the Torah says to do this, but what does that mean? And then they would say, well, this is what we've received. This is a tradition that we have. It's like precedent, just like common law, right? You have laws that have been passed by previous courts. They're interpreted, and then as times change, they're applied to new, scenarios. So the rabbis were interpreting biblical text, and then they were saying, this is the way that we understand that they should be kept. And then people would come to them and they would say, well, I have a certain case. I'm not clear what I should do. What is the law? And the rabbis essentially would adjudicate for them. They were, you can think of that as like a lawyer in some sense, but they had other roles. They would interpret. They were mystics. They might be healers. Sort of like all-inclusive of many different, like a holy man, I guess you could say. Some of them were known as wonder workers. That's where you have the connection, I think, to someone like Jesus of Nazareth, who's this like itinerant rabbi. He's teaching, but he's in the Jewish tradition. He's doing things that are Jewish. He's teaching from the Torah. There might be in the minds of many divergences, with other aspects of Judaism, but it's very similar to what was happening at the time. And so today, a rabbi, many people think of rabbis as sort of as priests. I mean, we don't have that function anymore because we have a class of individuals who are descendants of the priests, but since we don't have a temple, they don't really do the same things anymore. They have more of a symbolic role. But the rabbis are essentially the leaders of communities. They study religious text and they adjudicate. They tell you this is the way things should be kept, or they inspect. If you're interested in keeping the laws of the kosher laws, the laws of kashrut, and an animal has to be slaughtered in a certain way, the blood has to be drained in a certain way, we can't eat, certain fats. It doesn't have to be a rabbi, but the rabbi is usually going to be the person who is going to be studied in all those intricate laws. It's somebody that is very technical. They know all the specific cases. What about if there's a divorce? There's a certain way that we have to do it in Jewish law, apart from civil law. There's a certain way to get married. There's certain documents. So we have like a parallel legal system. In addition to the civil courts, we have Jewish religious courts, and the rabbis are that, they're the adjudicators of that process. And so as part of my responsibilities, I do marriages. I haven't done divorces, but if that were the case, I would need to do that. Or if there are conversions to Judaism, there's a certain, procedure that has to be followed. And then of course, teaching, leading the services, things of that nature generally fall under the purview of the rabbi. They don't have to. There can be people that are trained to do that. For example, before I became a rabbi, I served as what we would call a chazan, like a cantor for the synagogue. So we couldn't afford to pay anybody to sing all the prayers. So I learned them, and I could carry a tune. So I learned the prayers, and I would do that. And then as I, became a rabbi, we still couldn't afford to pay anybody. So I just sort of continued on with that responsibility. And then other people might learn them and become lay leaders in that specific area. But the rabbi is supposed to be the repository of that knowledge, and the one that's, able to say, okay, this is the way it should be done, or we need to look in this text to find the answer to whatever question, might be the case.
Got you. So let's back up when you were talking about like the Torah, which
Yes.
is for, Christians, the first 5 books of the Bible, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So as a Christian, I look at the Old Testament as kind of the Jewish Bible. Am I looking at that wrong? If I look at the Old Testament, is that basically y'all's Bible? Or is there more, less books, that kind of thing?
So we would call, what you would call the Old Testament. We have an acronym for it. We call it Tanakh, and it stands for the Torah. It stands for the Nevi'im, and it stands for the Ketuvim. So the Torah is what you mentioned, the first 5 books. The Nevi'im are the prophets. So you would think of like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, those people, those kind of individuals. And then the Ketuvim are the writings like Proverbs or Psalms or Ecclesiastes, things of that nature. So the texts themselves would be, of course, originally in Hebrew or in a few cases Aramaic. But there's another concept that's important. One of the fundamental ideas in traditional Judaism, and of course today we have other branches of Judaism that are, I guess you could say, more progressive or more modern. But traditionally, there was a concept that at Sinai, when Moses received the Torah at Sinai, he received it in 2 forms. There's the written form, the text, the scrolls that we have that are written in Hebrew, but there was also an oral transmission. And what that means is that the explanation of many of the commandments were provided. So for example, there's a case that you might remember where, or actually I can just give you a different case. There's one verse that says that you will, if you want to eat meat, you will slaughter it in the way that I have shown you. But it doesn't really elaborate. It just says, I have shown you this particular method because, of course, the concern was to drain all the blood, etc. But it doesn't get into details. It just gives you like a summary. And so the idea is that the oral transmission provides us all the details for the how-tos. So it's back to that idea of the legislative process. So I think in many ways what differentiates traditional Judaism is that, yes, we have the same text, but we have like a complementary explanation for all these different elements. So we would call it the dual Torah. We have the oral law, and then we have the written law. And the written law would be, for the most part, virtually the same as what Christians would have. And then as far as the other books, if you were to look at like a typical Protestant canon, it would be pretty much the same thing. There might be differences because of some of the texts that are being used. Like some, Christians will prefer to use the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of an original Hebrew. Catholics generally have used in the past the Vulgate, which is a Latin translation of the Hebrew and the Greek. So there's many different renditions. But the Catholic Church, as well as Eastern Orthodox churches, they have books that are called the Apocrypha, which are actually, they're still Jewish texts. And in fact, it's sort of interesting because if you look at the Catholic Church, for example, they have books like First and Second Maccabees. And those are really the most, I tell people all this, all the time, these are really the most Jewish books that you could find, because they talk about these individuals who were priests. They were Kohanim, they were serving in the temple in Jerusalem. And the Seleucids, which were one of the branches that, Alexander the Great has died, and he's divided up his kingdom into four, between his generals. This is one of the kingdoms that comes out of that. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to force Hellenization onto Jews. Hey, we love Jews. We just want you to look like us. We want you to behave like us. Why do you have to keep kosher? Why do you have to circumcise? Why do you have to keep the Sabbath? So they weren't anti-Semitic in that sense. They just wanted Jews to behave like they did. And so for the Maccabees, that was a great affront because, they're religious Jews. They're very serious about it. And so they saw this as an attack on their Judaism. And so to me, it's interesting that the Catholic Church has actually been the one to preserve that, because it's really the most Jewish book, because they fight, and then over a 25 years, they eventually win Jewish independence. And it's interesting is because it's about 165 years before the birth of Jesus. I think that's a good reference point. And this Jewish kingdom lasts for, depending on how you count, almost 90 years. And the reason it's important is because you have somebody like Herod the Great, which of course is mentioned in the New Testament, which is related indirectly to the Hasmoneans, to the Maccabees. So it's these interesting connections give you like an idea of how important these ideas were. And Hanukkah is the celebration of what happens in the book of Maccabees. And interestingly enough, I think, for Christians, this may prove interesting. In one of the Gospels, there's actually a reference to Hanukkah. It talks about the Festival of Lights, or the Feast of Dedication, I'm sorry. Not the Festival of Lights, but the Feast of Dedication. I think it's in the Gospel of John. So even the New Testament, which most people think is very removed, from the Jewish world, it still has all these elements, right? It may have a different focus, but all these cultural and religious elements are still there in the background. And if you just look for them, you can find them quite easily.
Right. Now, you mentioned denominations there within Christianity, and obviously the biggest, I guess, two denominations which go head to head are Catholicism and Protestantism. Now, within the Jewish faith, do you have denominations? Are they smaller than that kind of divide? I mean, within Protestants, you have some quite small differences, and there's a few ones like infant baptism, which cause a few, disagreements. But within the Jewish faith, are there different denominations?
Well, there are. It's interesting because in many ways, in the West, they seem to be the product of Western influence. And if you look at Mediterranean countries like in North Africa, or what we would call the Levant, like Syria, or Turkey, or if you go into Iraq and Iran, there used to be very large Jewish communities in all these places before the creation of the modern state of Israel. Morocco had something like 300,000 Jews before 1948. There were Jews in Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt. There used to be a very large Jewish community in Iraq. There's still Jews in Iran, oddly enough, about 20,000. But in those communities, especially what we would call Sephardic communities, it's a term that we use for Spain in the medieval period. They're very similar to each other, Sephardic and Mizrahi Eastern communities. There wasn't really a division there. There wasn't like what we would call Reform Judaism today or Conservative Judaism. There was just, everybody was part of the same synagogue, but there were different levels of observance. So if you were super religious, you would be at the synagogue, but there might be somebody next to you who, maybe they're not as pious, maybe they're not as strict with the kosher laws, or maybe they do things they're not supposed to do, but they only have one synagogue, and they're all part of that experience. So there were grades of observance in the same place. In the West, especially in Germany, and then as you know, France and England, and then you get to America, there's more of I think, a Protestant influence where you have to have the right belief in addition to practice. And so the rise of Reform Judaism, for example, comes about in Germany, and then it really flourishes in the US in the 1800s. And so today we have something like 4 or 5 different denominations in the US. There's really 3 big ones. You could say Orthodoxy, which is very broad, Orthodox Judaism, and there are many different groups within that. So sometimes people have a tendency to, paint a broad brush and assume that everybody's, wears a black hat and has a big beard, that kind of thing. But there are many groups within that. And then you have conservative Judaism, which used to be basically modern Judaism. It was a lot of Hebrew. They were very serious about the kosher laws and Shabbat, the Sabbath. And then as things changed, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, they became, I guess what you say, more liberal or more progressive. And that denomination has shrunk considerably. And then Reform Jews were the ones that were more focused on what they would call the ethical aspects. They didn't see Jewish law as binding. If you wanted to keep it, that was okay, but they focused in on more the ideals as they understood them. So, today I think you have Reform Judaism in the United States is the largest denomination. Orthodox Jews are really, quite small, maybe 10, 12% in the US. And then you have another group, maybe 18% that are conservative. And then you have a very big group of Jews that don't affiliate with any particular denomination. And then you have some smaller branches that have, 2, 3%, something like that. So it's really, I think, in many ways divided over the level of observance. Do you take the laws as strictly as one group versus the other? So if you're stricter, you're going to usually be, Orthodox or in that area, traditional. If you're not as observant, you're going to be in the more Reform or progressive camp. So those are really, I think the major differences in the sense that in Christianity, you have doctrinal statements, right? You can, a Baptist and a Presbyterian and all these different, they have like a statement on their websites and so forth. And sometimes, to an outsider, there can be very small differences. Like you said, infant baptism versus adult baptism. But sometimes it's just about beliefs. It might not be necessarily over practice. But in the Jewish world, it's usually over practice. There might be theological differences, but it ultimately boils down to how you view the laws. There was a famous case back in the 1800s where American Orthodox rabbis and American Reform rabbis, they were trying to form an organization, because they were immigrants and they wanted to sort of build like a coalition, I guess you could say. And what the Reform rabbis did is they served, pork and lobster and all kinds of stuff. And the Orthodox rabbis were like, there's no way that we can engage, on this level. It's something that we can't transgress. So that was an extreme example. But it's sort of, at the time, it represented this break, between the two communities, because the Reform were like, no, we have to think about the ethical aspects of the Bible, justice for the poor, almost like a social justice type of emphasis. And then, the Orthodox were like, well, that's all good and wonderful, but we also have to remember that, circumcision, the Sabbath, all these laws, we're tasked with keeping them. So there was like this big rift that occurred. In many ways, you could say that part of that has, I wouldn't say healed, but there's sort of been a rapprochement to some extent on both sides. But the communities are still in many ways very divided. They might participate with each other on larger Jewish issues, but on a practical level, they're very different in the way that they observe Judaism.
So one question kind of going into the denominations. You didn't mention this one, so maybe it doesn't really count as a denomination or whatever the Jewish community calls the denominations, because, we're not going to hide the fact we're both Christians here, so we're kind of speaking from the Christian point of view, so we'll use Christian language, and then you can correct us for the Jewish portion of the language we should be using to ask the questions. But I've heard about Messianic Jews, and I've read just a little bit about it, just not enough to really know exactly what it is, but it absolutely confuses me. And so I'd like for you to clear my head and clear up my confusion, because when I read about what a Messianic Jew is, it is a Jew that believes that Jesus Christ was the Messiah, which to me, I'm like, well, wait a second. I thought Jews didn't believe that. So can you clear that up for me, what a Messianic Jew is?
Well, it's a very contentious issue in the Jewish community because let me go back a little bit to talk about I talked in the beginning, I mentioned about the tragic relationship between the two communities. And this is, as I mentioned, when I talked about Britain and Spanish Jews, it's a subject that is very near and dear to me because you have these Jews in Spain and Portugal who were living in a predominantly Christian country, but there were also Muslims at the time in the medieval period. So you had Jews, Muslims, and Christians. And sometimes people idealize that type of environment. Oh, there was this unique flourishing of the three cultures and the three religions. And there was some type of coming to terms with each other out of necessity that happened. But there were also times of great friction and unfortunately violence. And so for me, the subject of Jews and Christianity is very important because that's one of the areas of study that I focused in on when I was at one of the colleges that I mentioned. So if you look back further, if you look back to the first century, as I mentioned, you have this individual Jesus of Nazareth who is proclaiming a particular message. And on a very simple level, there's nothing un-Jewish about it. I mean, there were other people who were healers. There were other people who were holy men. Over time, what happens is the majority of the Jewish community doesn't accept the messianic claims that are ascribed to Jesus, for whatever reason, because they don't see the messianic era dawn, or because the Romans are still there, or because they see it become a non-Jewish movement, because the majority of the individuals that start to adhere to that are non-Jews, right? You have the works of Paul, Acts and so forth. I mean, the New Testament is very focused in on the salvation of the nations, right? That's I think everybody would agree to that. And so over time, you have a movement that started on Jewish soil in the land in Judea, the land of Israel, the Galilee, and as it spreads, it brings in non-Jews, Romans and Greeks and so forth. And I think you could argue, I mean, this is an area that's very important for me to study, is that you have a transformation that happens because in some sense, even though there are Jewish ideas, you talked about the Old Testament, quote unquote, is part of the Christian canon, right? I mean, it's you can't refute it. The New Testament is quoting the Old Testament as it were, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. There are Jewish ideas. The Messiah is a Jewish idea. Which God is it? Well, it's the God of Israel that they're talking about. I mean, it's inescapable, right? But something happens where it sort of ventures off and becomes like a very different expression of faith. And as time grows, it's like you have sibling rivalry between these two groups, because on the one hand, many Christians, not all, but many Christians are saying, well, the Jews don't accept the messianic claims of Jesus, so therefore we believe, and you can look at that in various church fathers, their relationship with God has been cut off. Even though God chose them, they were once God's chosen people. We started a new era, and so they've been displaced. And in academic terms, we call that supersessionism. They've been superseded, or they've been displaced or replaced. And so there's like a back and forth because, Jews will say, no, that's not true. You're the pagans, and they'll be back and forth. And in the beginning, in the first few centuries, the two groups are in many ways sort of not equal, but neither group has like a dominant position. I mean, Jews have certain advantages in the Roman Empire because they're an ancient people. And in the beginning, Christians or adherents to Christianity don't, because, the Romans don't know what to do with them, right? We don't know if they're atheists. We don't know if they're Jews. We don't know what they are. But as time passes, and then the Roman Empire eventually becomes Christianized, Christians are in a dominant position, and they begin to change their attitude towards Jews. Jews don't have the same rights. Obviously Christianity is given a preference in the Roman Empire, and it's sort of tragic because as Christianity rises, the plight of Jews begins to fall. And then you see this kind of anti-Jewish and anti-Judaism element become characteristic of many Christians, not all, but certainly many prominent voices. And if we trace that through the medieval period, there's the Jews are a minority, and of course the Christians are in a position of prominence. And so there's often violence that comes about through that. I mentioned one aspect of the Inquisition, but there are pogroms, crusades happen, and Jews are in a position where they're not really able to defend themselves. And whatever Christians might do to protect them, there are plenty of Christians that don't. And they're the ones that are unfortunately inflicting violence. So there's a lot of emotion here. And then as time passes and we get into the modern era, we see a lot of anti-Semitism continue to exist in modern Europe, even among individuals that we would consider enlightened, and individuals who you would say, well, they say they're Christian, they're professing Christians. And if you read, and I don't know what denomination you guys are from, so I don't mean to offend, but if you look at some of the works of certain Lutheran, theologians and many others, you find these anti-Jewish biases and these very troubling statements. So this issue is very emotional for Jews. And so the idea that a Jew would accept the messianic claims of Jesus, it doesn't make sense to the majority of Jews. And so the issue has to do with what we would call the halachic status of the Jew. Now, what is halacha? It's Jewish law, to put it very simply. And it's the question of, can the Jewishness of the individual ever be lost? And so most Jews will say, well, if a person converts to another religion, they're an apostate. They've lost their Jewish status. It's like they've become a citizen of another country, and by default, they've lost their citizenship. But there are other people and other rabbis who have said, well, Jewishness is not something that you can lose. You might be a bad Jew, you might be an apostate Jew, you might be a heretic, but there's something innate within that legal status of a Jew that means that you can't lose that Jewish status. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not going to be, not punished, but there are going to be penalties for that.
Like my son, he's a football fan, and he started rooting for the Philadelphia Eagles instead of the Dallas Cowboys, and so he's basically an apostate. He's still kind of a football fan, but he's not really welcome in the house when the Philadelphia Eagles are playing the Cowboys. He has to watch through the window outside.
And not even the window of your house either.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's sort of an interesting way to approach it. So traditionally, if somebody who had become a Christian or a Messianic Jew, if they came to the synagogue, many rabbis would say, well, you're not welcome, or we're not going to call you up to the Torah, to do a reading, or we're not going to count you in something called the minyan, a quorum of 10 men. They're like penalties, basically. We're not going to circumcise your kids. That has been the majority view, and that has been sort of standard. Now, I think today, because we have so many Jews that are intermarried with non-Jews, especially Christians, it has caused a lot of rabbis to sort of not necessarily change their opinion, but to approach it differently and to say, what are we doing? Can we be more accepting without approving, if that makes sense? Can we say, listen, we're not going to give you a thumbs up, but if you come to services, we're not, as long as you're not causing trouble, as long as you're not passing out tracts, as long as you're not trying to convert people to believe what you believe, you can come to the service. So there have been people who have been much more conciliatory in that sense. It's still a very contentious issue. It's very emotional. In many ways, I think what it is that there's a fear of the assimilation and the loss of the Jewish people. Sometimes people will talk, of course, the Holocaust, the Shoah. You have the death of millions of Jews, and today in America, we have so many Jews that have sort of given up their Jewish identity by simply not doing anything. And so when people say, well, you have a Messianic Jew or a Jews for Jesus or things of that nature, or a Christian Jew, they see that in the same way. They see that as a heretical belief, their beliefs there about God that they can't accept, but they also see it as a sense of they're destroying Jewish identity, and that identity is not going to be carried forward into the next generation. So it's almost like the preservation of the people. If you don't hold to certain views, that's going to be a consequence of it. I think that's the way many people are thinking. My perspective has been much more conciliatory and open. We have people that come to our synagogues. They're very small, but we have Christians that come and visit. We have people that are, in that kind of situation that you mentioned, that somebody, for whatever reason, something in the 60s or 70s, they joined a church. And now as an older adult, they say, I'm sort of rediscovering my Jewish background. I mean, we have people like that come through. Now, usually they don't stay, but I think we have adopted a much more embracing approach, and I think it's to help the individual and to have a conversation. It's I think that's the most important part, just to have open dialogue and explain why Jews have these responses and what the concerns are. And then, of course, we live in a modern society, so people are going to choose what, and how they are going to respond to that.
Yeah, you touched upon anti-Semitism there a couple of times, and I think there was a hope that once the internet started taking hold, especially among nations where perhaps there'd been an inherent distrust and dislike of the Jewish faith, that things would change. But it seems that nothing has really changed in terms of those same old stereotypes and this view of Jewish leaders being insidious in their intent. And, even very subtle things such as, you take The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare, Shylock's character, that was a very stereotypical character, which probably didn't change in terms of people's stereotypes of Jews for centuries. And even now, if you watch TV, you could probably if you watched 1,000 hours of TV, you could probably get a good idea of what a Christian was and what a Christian believes. The Islamic faith, it's pretty much left alone on most TV shows, but it's given a lot of respect when it is written upon, mainly not to cause offense, which they don't seem to mind if it's Christians or Jewish people if they cause offense. But what can be done really to educate people now on the Jewish faith? Because, you've got, I guess, famous Jewish figureheads, or at least what people consider figureheads, like Mark Zuckerberg, and that just gives rise to even more of this kind of conspiracy theory type thing of, the Jews are trying to take over the world, they have this agenda to, enslave people, and instead of getting better, it seems to have got worse. And, with the rise again of certain facets of far-right nationalism in Europe and more anti-Semitism, where do you think it goes from here? How can it be changed to stop this getting to a point where, again, the Jewish people are going to be made a scapegoat and perhaps persecuted?
Right, and kind of going along those same lines, and my wife is a huge fan of the show Friends, and of course you have Ross, and he's Jewish, and there's that famous scene where he's dressed as an armadillo and wants to teach his son about, Hanukkah and the Maccabees and all that. Is that kind of the complete opposite way to go? Is that kind of sacrilegious to say, well, let me dress as an armadillo and pretend to be a Jewish armadillo?
Well, let me start off by saying that there's something called the Pew Research Study. They put out these demographic studies every certain number of years. I'm not sure how often it is, but I think there was one in 2015 or something like that. I can't remember when the last one was. But they survey the Jewish community. I'm sure they do this for other, religious groups, but they go very in depth, and they actually, interestingly enough, sort of address this issue of that you mentioned about Messianic Jews as well. But they survey the Jewish community. They do age brackets, how they identify, their economic status. I mean, very, very in depth, what they believe and so forth. And one of the points that I thought was interesting was that I think it said 25% at that time of the American Jewish community made above $100,000. That was like, sort of a, top echelon. But I tell people all the time, that means that 75% don't. And then when you looked at the demographic studies, there were actually close to 30% that were near the poverty level. And I think that was shocking to most people. And I said, I know another rabbi in the area. His name is Rabbi Frank Joseph, just an incredible individual. He's a leader. He's like an itinerant rabbi of 4 different congregations. He travels to South Texas, like on a rotating schedule, but he has a full-time job. And in many ways, I see him as a great example for, the path that I took. He is a special ed teacher. I'm not sure if he's about to retire, but that's what he does. I mean, his wife works. This is very, the people that made up his congregation in the area were school teachers. There was just sort of, I wouldn't say blue collar jobs, but just sort of average working individuals. And in our communities, we have some computer programmers, but we have, electricians or HVAC, technicians. We have normal people and people with mortgages and, trying to pay the bills and just normal things. So I think on the one side, yes, there are going to be people, Jews are always going to be prominent. I think part of it is the culture, that even if people are not religious, I don't think Mark Zuckerberg is very religious in any way that I know of, but many people have inherited a tradition, which is we're the people of the book. But I tell people we're the people of the books, reading, these kinds of things were inculcated at a time when literacy was at a very low rate, in ancient times, in the medieval period. The power of study was something that was, how can you say, focused in on. Cultures emphasize what they believe. How can I put it? The Vikings, my train of thought, the Vikings saw their Valhalla as a continuation of their violent struggles here, right? Their wars, and they would drink and they would fight because that's what they idealized. But in the Jewish mind, heaven or the world to come was what we call a heavenly yeshiva. It was where people would study. God would study, Hashem would study, as we would say, because that's what was idealized. And so I think that idea of study was something that passed on to people, even if they were religious or not. And maybe that explains why so many Jews have been successful. But all that being said is that I think we have to emphasize the normalcy or the normality of most Jews. They're just trying to live a life, send their kids to school, and make the best of their lives. I think that the response is more engagement with non-Jews. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, I think, if I remember correctly, said that the response to anti-Semitism should be more Judaism. And by more Judaism, it's more communication. I had a church reach out to me about a month ago, and they said, would you be interested in teaching a seminar on the history of Jews in Spain and Portugal? And I said, hey, I would love to do that. I think that basic engagement, just the conversation itself is it breaks those barriers. And it's not about, I'm not trying to convince them of anything. I'm just teaching history. But that kind of, engagement, I think, is critical to show people that we're just normal people. And yes, we have an ancient tradition. We have an ancient religion. Yes, we do feel that we're chosen, but it's chosen for a specific duty, a specific purpose, a specific mission. It doesn't mean superiority. I think that's maybe one thing that people often think about, that Jews have a sense of superiority. It has a tremendous amount of responsibility. And it's not easy to be Jewish if you are much more devout and observant. You don't eat in certain places. You don't do certain things on the Saturdays or Friday nights. You're very meticulous about many things, and it comes sometimes at financial sacrifices. You have to spend more money on certain food that, you just don't go anywhere, and many things. And so I think that education is critical. And I think that Christians, because of just the reality of the United States, they're the perfect point of contact. I think many of the early Christians in the United States, they had a tremendous love for the Bible, for the Hebrew scriptures. I think, the Puritans and other groups, whatever points we may disagree on, they valued the idea that God had revealed himself to the people of Israel. And I think that it's not about having a complete agreement, but to say, yeah, we have something in common. We have a biblical text, and let's engage on that. Let's talk about that. What are the things that we can both agree on? So I think that's really the key. Social media, that's very complicated. Even in the pandemic, you have people, spreading. I've seen it myself, spreading conspiracy theories about Jews being behind COVID-19 and just all kinds of things. I think in many ways, some people have even argued that one of the reasons that Israel was so adamant about, pushing through with vaccinations was because they wanted to dispel the idea that somehow Jews were, causing, something malevolent through the vaccines or something. I don't know, but it's you see this like in all kinds of area. If there's economic crisis, if there's a depression, if anything is almost like the instigator for these kinds of issues to come up. And I think we have to address them, individually as best as we can.
I can honestly say I learned something today. I didn't realize that the Vikings were Irish. because according to him, the Vikings just like to drink and fight, and I'm pretty sure that's an Irish thing, right? I didn't think that was a Viking thing. But now, all kidding aside, you brought this up a couple of times, so now I'm going to kind of hit you with a little bit of a curveball, and I don't mean this to sound like a curveball, but you've kind of mentioned a few times about how, you know, you and multiple people kind of in your same position also hold down normal jobs. And not that an engineer is a normal job by any means, because neither one of us could be engineers by any means, but a regular, 9-to-5 job, whatever, and it's not your profession to be a rabbi. However, we hear all the time about, especially Christian churches, you got your Joel Osteens who have like multi-million-dollar mansions, and you've got these churches that are filled with, pastors, preachers, ministers, whatever you want to call them, and they have all this money or whatever. Can you give us a little bit of take on that? Is that something that is maybe causing some of the distrust in religion today when you look at somebody like a Joel Osteen and you say, well, hang on a second, you got all this money, and there's other people out there that are actually working 9-to-5 jobs and trying to do the right thing, but I'm supposed to, tithe 10% to your church so you can buy another private jet?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question, because I was reading an article. There's an individual, Kenneth Copeland, I think, in Fort Worth.
He's another one. Yeah.
He's the richest. I read an article about his, jets, and he has like a parsonage. I don't know what they call it, but there's a part of me sometimes that envies the ability to be a full-time clergy, men or rabbi. But I think, like I said before, I think there's a disconnect that happens, and I'm not casting an aspersion on the average rabbi or pastor, but there's something that is more challenging. I get up early and I do the basic prayers. I have to do that before I start work. I have to do all the things I have to do. And then somebody might call and say, hey, we have somebody in, hospital. Or so I did a funeral several weeks ago, or about a couple months ago, actually. And I took off a day from work, and I did it so I could go and officiate the funeral. And it was my privilege to do so. And it was my duty, but it's not simple, right? Because I have to take time off from work, and I'm not complaining that in any sense. I'm just saying it's those practicalities that sometimes become difficult, because, if you want to visit somebody in the hospital or something like that, I've got 3 kids, you've got limited time, I've got meetings and things of that nature. So on the one hand, I see the benefit to like a full-time person in the religious world. And yet at the same time, I do think there's that disconnect of, especially if you're living far beyond the means of your regular congregants. I don't understand how that is consistent, with any religious tradition. I'm not saying that people have to be poor. I don't think that that's right either. But I think in many ways it sort of undercuts the message of what they're trying to promote. I mean, if it's Christianity and if it's if it's the gospel, I think a key component of that is caring for the poor, and the people that are mistreated, and the orphans, and I mean those kinds of ideas are obviously found in Judaism as well. So I think that that's a problem, because it gives people the impression that it's like a business. And I mean, on a certain level, you have to think about synagogues and churches as a business, just on a practical level, right? You have to pay certain bills, or if you have a building. But I think at a certain level, when you achieve so much growth, I think it disconnects you from the members of that community. I mean, some synagogues and temples in Dallas, the largest ones, there's one temple here that has like 5,000 people. So they have maybe 3 to 5 rabbis on staff. I mean, they have to, because there's just no way that you can interact. So yeah, I would want to have more people, but at the same time, having smaller groups allows you to be part of those lives and helps you to understand, you get to see the kids grow up. You get, you might even be the one to marry them, and they're, so it's like much more intimate. And I think that there's something there that maybe has been lost by these mega churches and these mega synagogues. And I mean, I couldn't feel comfortable in that environment.
Right. I like I've always told my kid, looking at it through the eyes of my dad, right? And you say, well, the preacher is driving a Cadillac, right? And they say, well, it's an awful nice car for him to drive. And I might say, well, Cadillac, I mean, it's just a Cadillac. But if he drives a Ferrari, now maybe I've got a problem with the Ferrari, and somebody else that's, some rich guy living in South Lake, Texas, like, Ferrari, really? I mean, he's driving that Italian piece of trash. He should be driving a Rolls Royce. And then you say, well, Rolls Royce, that's a highfalutin car. Why should he drive that? And then you got the other guy saying, drive? Why shouldn't he be riding in a helicopter everywhere? And I told my kid that, and my kid's like, well, I kind of get that. And I've tried to explain to him, I'm like, it's not really our job to judge it per se, but we're going to, by human nature, right, look at that. You're going to look at whether or not the guy's got a Seiko on his wrist, or he's got a $25,000 Rolex on his wrist. Or, is he driving a Ferrari or a Rolls Royce, or is he got a limo somewhere? But are they supposed to suffer, or are they supposed to be treated a little bit better because they have a huge responsibility to their congregants, their parishioners, whatever word you want to choose?
Yeah, and before you jump in there, Juan, I mean, from my point of view, growing up in England, we didn't really have anything like a mega church. Towards London, there were some certain larger churches, but they weren't necessarily infamous at the time because of their pastors and any particular riches. But I think the disconnect comes in that money has always been a great divider throughout history. Birthright and money have always been, the shortcuts to being in that elite group that sets you apart from everybody else. And I think it was Karl Marx who said, religion is the opium of the people, in terms that people will put up with anything, any hardship, as long as they have that faith. And so it's not a good idea to shake that faith or take away that faith, because a faith in God will allow people to go through any amount of hardship. But it becomes more difficult in difficult times when you see the leaders of the churches with 2 airplanes, helicopters, and living this kind of lavish lifestyle and saying, oh, I'm being blessed by God, which is great on the one hand. But, if you've been in any of those mega churches, and I've been in a couple around North Texas, the predominant message, is tithe, give the church 10%. And it's mentioned at least a couple of times in the services, in most of the literature. And people...
Ironically, a piece of the Jewish faith, right?
Yeah. And... people feel obliged to, like, oh, I need to do this so I too can get blessed. But on a personal level, I have an issue with that, simply because, I believe that if a nuclear bomb fell on the studio right now, God wouldn't even need to snap his fingers. He could just will it and we'd be made whole again. So I don't have any barriers to my faith in God, but I do have an issue with men of God flaunting riches in front of, perhaps parishioners and, people following the faith who are not in that position. And I mean, you have to remember, most of the Christians in the world are very, very poor. They're in countries which are very, very poor. And now all of those countries have access to the internet. And the first thing they see, when they go on there is, obviously the top search results for Christianity and all this is all these mega churches. And you can join the church now. You can live in Uganda, but join this church in Texas, and you can tithe online and get all the benefits of the people who live in Texas and actually attend the church in person. And I think that disconnect will always cause a problem between people and the leaders of the church. There's going to be that mistrust, because why do you need that money? If I got an itemized bill of, look, we spent this on this, and this, and you saw that, yep, pretty much all this money went to good causes or investment into good causes, I'd be okay with that. But when somebody buys a second private jet and justifies it by, and I won't mention the preacher's name.
Unknown caller.
And
gotta love it when the phone does that.
That was them right there. They're calling up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
they're already there.
Yeah, okay. They
Money
my church literally just called me and like, y'all need to shut this down.
You need to get off the air. But I mean, a famous preacher from around here said he didn't want to travel on commercial airlines because it's traveling in a tube full of demons. Yes, and I'll be honest with you, to me, that's not really going to endear me to a leader who has that attitude towards regular people. And, you know, to your point you were making, you have a regular 9-to-5 job and you're a rabbi, and it seems that, you know, the Jewish faith has it in balance. And for the most part, I think, you know, the Catholic faith mostly has it in balance, with the exception of once you start getting into, start getting into the European and Roman Catholicism and the money surrounding that and the Vatican. But I mean, in terms of North America, I mean, I know there are...
Last time I checked, the Pope Mobile is only one car made for one dude.
Right.
So,
yeah. But you know what I mean? I mean, but for the most part, normal everyday Catholics and normal everyday Catholic churches, there's not that much emphasis placed on, hey, you've got to give, you know, your money to the church, you know, and you get all these leaders rise up, you know, basically being carried on gold cushions. So I'm not entirely sure where I was going from that.
I don't know either.
Because I hijacked your point, but...
Yes, you did.
I hijacked your point, but...
This is the longest question I think you've ever asked, and you don't even know what you're going to ask.
I don't even know its question. It's just getting off my chest. I disagree with the whole Christian church having a ton of money, because it creates a disconnect, which I don't think can be put together, regardless of the words that come out of your mouth.
Well, I think there may not necessarily be an equivalent in the majority of the Jewish community, but there are elements in some communities where I talked about study being, that's like the ultimate achievement, to study the Torah. We say Torah lishma, to study the Torah for its own sake, is like the epitome of a Jewish life. And in some Jewish communities, you have individuals that study all day. And essentially they, the wives may have to work to basically support the husband so he can study all day, especially they might have multiple kids. There are many communities do that. It's not something that is prominent in the US, but there are communities that do that. And, you know, there was one great rabbi that his name was the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. And he effectively said, you know, the Torah is not a spade. You know, you can't use it to dig to make money. Now, if I do a wedding, you know, maybe I get somebody gives me like an honorarium or something like that. But we never reject anybody because they can't do that. It's something that they do of their own accord. But I think the issue is you see it more prominently in churches. I think because of the big buildings and of the television presence. In the Jewish world, you might see it in certain environments, but it's that study process where people are basically making study their profession. And then in Israeli society, it becomes an issue of great contention, because you have individuals that are like, hey, I'm going into the army. Why don't they go into the army? Oh, it's because they're studying. And it's like a lifelong deferment, instead of some religious to say, no, we're going to go to the army and we're going to study and we're going to do both. You know, we're going to live a religious life and we're going to be dedicated to the defense of the state of Israel. You know, so there are always extremes in any religious expression. I've had some people that, they live in the area, but they don't want to come to our synagogue, which is in our home, because they're like, I want to go to a building. You know, I feel like it's more legitimate. I want to have like it's like, okay, that's perfectly fine, you know, but of course the commitment to that, you're going to have to be responsible for that, right? If you want to go to a place that has a building, then you've got upkeep and you've got usually salaries, because there's going to be somebody that's going to be tending to that. So I think people, you know, they get disconnected from these larger communities. And, you know, we rely sort of on everybody, all hands on deck, when my wife had our last son, she had an emergency in the after the delivery. She was in an ICU, and we had our community, you know, they came out, they made food, you know, they stayed with the kids. It was just something very familial to it. And I think that maybe ideally, it may not be practical, but, you know, I would say churches and synagogues would have that kind of element to them, right? Where they're small enough where they can care for people on a real, like a first name basis kind of thing, where they know the people. And I think that sort of, to me, is like a big issue. Like when you get so big that you can't connect with people, I don't know what the point is. And yes, they might be able to, you know, raise funds for some type of endeavor, but, you know, I've met Christians who were missionaries in Africa, and they didn't live, these fantastically rich lives. I mean, they may have lived a decent life, you know, maybe if they're part of a compound or, you know, some type of a missionary activity, but I respect that. It's a tremendous amount of commitment and sacrifice. I couldn't do that, but it's something that I see, like, these people really believe what they believe. And, they're really committed to that. And I don't see that in those kind of examples that you mentioned, where they have these just beyond the pale wealth. I don't see that.
Right. So let's shift gears before you go on another tangent. I've always heard that in the Jewish religion that the Jews believed that the construction of the third temple basically brings the end times. So am I accurate on that? Am I inaccurate on that? And why hasn't there been a third temple built?
Well, I think there's a lot of discussion on that topic. I would say that the idea is that the rebuilding of the temple would be initiated by Hashem, by God, through the Messiah. So he would rebuild the temple, and it would enact this Messianic age. So in that sense, I don't know that we would say, the end times as Christians think of it. There are some parallels, based on Ezekiel, and many different commentators talk about that. So there are a lot of similarities, but I think it's more of a sense that it has to be divinely done. It can't be like a human effort. If you look at the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, and then under the Persians, under Cyrus and Darius, they're like, okay, you guys can go back and you can rebuild this. The Persian Empire is going to essentially fund it. We're going to endorse it. And, Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah, they restart it. And then, of course, Herod the Great, as I mentioned, is involved in that process as well. And then it's destroyed again, by the Romans. And I think Jews have had the desire to rebuild the temple throughout, especially in those early centuries. The best, I think the most, what would be the word, likely time for it to have happened was under Julian the Apostate, one of the Roman emperors, after the conversion of Constantine. He was favorably disposed toward Jews. Maybe it was because he didn't like Christians, I'm not sure. But it seemed like that was the time that it might happen. And then, of course, after Julian dies, the empire sort of reverts back to its Christianized leanings. And I think after the rise of Islam and all these things, it's really, it's been in the back of our minds, but there are very few groups that are vested in that. There was a group that came to Dallas that I think like 2 weeks ago, and they actually spoke at a church, which is rather interesting. They were part of this institute in the land of Israel that is committed to the rebuilding of the temple. And what they do is they claim that they are training priests, Kohanim, and Levites, Leviim, and they're teaching them all the laws that are related to their duties and their the things that they'll be practicing. So they're sort of in the sense of getting things ready. But to be honest, is the majority of Jews don't really they're not involved with that. It's actually more of like a Christian interest, which is sort of interesting, because there are Jews that are interested in this, but they usually wind up promoting it to Christians because they're actually the ones that seem to be more interested. Most Jews, I guess we almost see it as something that has to come about supernaturally, because then it's like, well, who's going to be the Cohen? Who's going to be the Cohen Hagadol, the high priest? What about if you have multiple family? I mean, it's just like it would be craziness, whose claims are going to be the ones to be established as the legitimate priest, and everything related to that. And of course, the sacrificial system, the korbanot, as we call them, it's just a very complicated thing. I think that, we have the Temple Mount, people identify the Western Wall, or people used to call it the Wailing Wall. It's interesting because, you have a mosque on top. And for many years, Jews were not allowed to pray, even when Israel was in control of Jerusalem after the 6-Day War, because the what do they call it? The people that are in charge of that are actually like under Jordan. They're like the trustees of the Temple Mount. They have a deal with the Jordanian government. But now Jews have been allowed to pray on the Temple Mount, and it's amazing, because if you think about it, this is the place where Solomon's temple, where Herod's temple once stood, and of course for most Jews, this is the place that will one day have the third temple. So the fact that Jews are praying there is almost it's historic. So it's like we're sort of closer to it, but we don't know exactly how that process comes about. And I think that building is part of this redemptive process that many Jews talk about. When you see that, it's like, oh my gosh, this is actually something that is momentous. It's supernatural. It's something that is clear to everybody that that God is in the process of redeeming all the Jews from all over the world or something of that nature. So it's a complicated topic.
Yeah. Now, in the Old Testament, there's a few things which people have a hard job grasping, and in Christianity, it's pretty much avoided. And we had a Christian author on about 6 weeks ago who talked about the Nephilim in the Old Testament. And, growing up in the Christian church, they never talked about that topic, just like they kind of sidestepped the whole Jewish opposition to shellfish, which stopped one of my friends actually turning to the Jewish faith because he was a big shrimp fan. But
well, I was going to go into this, but lobster is tasty.
Yeah, it is. It is tasty. So that's our big barrier to the Jewish faith, shellfish.
Yeah. I'm guessing you're not a big pulled pork sandwich fan. Things like that.
Texas is a worse place to do it.
No, how do you even survive in Texas knowing that in Dallas you have so many places you can go and have probably the best pulled pork sandwich in the entire world, and you're not going and doing that?
Well, it's interesting because Dallas actually has, we have about five kosher restaurants, which is quite a bit, because we're in the South, not like the bastion of Judaism, but we have 5. And then there's some, depending on your level of kashrut, your observance, there might be some vegan places that certain people eat at. It's hard. The restaurants are good. It's tough, because I live in Grand Prairie. So I live in like the mid-cities area. We have to go to North Dallas to get all of our meat, chicken, beef, lamb, because we don't have any kosher butchers in this area. So we have to go to the Tom Thumbs in North Dallas. We do have some Jewish things, like at the Tom Thumb in Grand Prairie. They started to get special bread, challah, for the Sabbath. They have some Jewish wine, and they have like a little section, which I was impressed by. But there's small pockets of Jews in Arlington and Grand Prairie and all these different cities. So you see like a little bit of a Jewish presence. And for the first time I saw Target and Walmart, they had Hanukkah stuff, during the holidays. They had Hanukkahs, menorahs, they had candies. And, so I guess that's like a big progress, that a Jewish presence is being recognized even in those quarters of the city.
I guess before you finish the question, let's talk a little bit about stereotypes. On Christmas, did you eat Chinese food?
No, but I had some friends that did, and we were supposed to go over to celebrate with them, but they ate all the food before we got there. So.
Oh, that's too bad.
Now, there are any popular Jewish dishes which are pretty mainstream in Western culture, but we don't realize they're of a Jewish origin?
Well, it depends on the particular Jewish origin that we're talking about. So in the United States, most Jews are from German, Polish, Russian backgrounds. Of course, I'm from the Spanish and Portuguese side. If you're Moroccan, the food will reflect the dominant culture. So I would say, if you think about like hummus, I don't know if you've seen like the Sabra brand.
I don't want to think about hummus. I really don't. It's like curry. I can't stand it.
Anything where the genesis is some type of vegetable.
That's true.
He won't eat it.
Yes.
If there's a religion which only eats meat, he's going to join that one.
I think I started it.
It doesn't matter what they believe, as long as they just eat meat only.
Right.
You'll sign up. You'll be your backup. Religion. Yeah.
So we have a lot more Mediterranean type foods, in our circles. Of course, something like bagels or lox and bagels, things like that. Those are usually from Eastern European backgrounds, but they're usually the foods that were prominent in those areas, like from Polish backgrounds. You might have Poles that were eating the same things, but Poles might put some pork there, for you guys.
But the Polish, they make great sausage. I love Polish sausage, which is kind of ironic.
German sausage. Yeah.
There have been, Jewish equivalents. Some of them use beef, but you have like these parallel cuisines that develop. So wherever you are, the Jewish food will generally reflect that, and there might be some, innovations that come along with that, but it'll be reflective of the dominant culture. So I think that we have, every year in Dallas, there's a Jewish kosher barbecue that one of the synagogues holds, and people, or kosher chili, kosher chili cook-off.
Oh.
Yeah, so they, people come out.
You had my interest and you lost it with chili. I'm not a chili fan.
I love chili.
Are there beans in the chili?
It's up to you. It's up to you. It's up to who's making them.
No, that is incorrect. There is no beans in chili. You are from Texas. Now, come on. There is no beans in chili. You know better than that. That has nothing to do with religion except for the religion of Texas chili, and you don't put beans in chili in Texas.
Now, has there been any kind of push from the plant-based meat fraternities in trying to push stuff towards the Jewish faith as such?
Like
because
plant-based lobster?
Yeah, plant-based pork and all that stuff. Because, I mean,
we actually... Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, no, that's fine. I take part in this mystery shopper type thing where I get sent all these coupons to get free samples of food. And recently they've been sending me a ton of these plant-based meats, coupons for these meats. And I've been going in, getting them and trying them. And I've tried them in various recipes. And it doesn't matter if I use like half a carton of cayenne or something. It's just very difficult to hide. But I figured, a lot of these companies would be kind of thinking, the Jewish religion, maybe we can... hit them a little bit heavy without artificial pork and artificial shrimp and all this other I'm not even sure if that exists, to be honest with you. But
Well, we did. There is. Are you familiar with Morningstar, the
yes,
brand?
Yes.
If you look at their, they have sausages, they have bacon. If you look at the label, like in the corner, there'll be either I think they have like a little triangle with a K and a little D, and that means it's kosher dairy. Or there might be a circle U. That's the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations. So they're different kosher symbols. And whenever you go shopping, just look and see if you find like a little U or a K or something with a circle or something. And there's a lot of plant-based alternatives. In fact, if you go to the Tom Thumb in North Dallas, 2 of them, they have fish-based crab meat in the kosher section. And it's just whitefish that somehow they've put some kind of different ingredients, I guess, to mimic it. So there are
almost
things like that.
Subway should have done that, because remember their tuna sandwich turned out to not even be tuna. Maybe they should be paying attention to this, because that was some nasty tuna. If you ever had a tuna sandwich from Subway,
no.
I guarantee you that couldn't have been kosher. I mean, I don't even know what the rules are there, but that should have been like, hey, guys, this is, don't eat this. That is nasty. It's not even tuna.
Now, sorry, just circling back to that thing about the Nephilim, what is the Jewish view on the Nephilim? Because, I mean, we were educated, like, beyond belief. This guy knew the answer to every single question we had, knew basically the Old Testament forwards, backwards, and in random order, and opened our eyes to a lot of stuff which would never been really taught before. Is there any teaching about the Nephilim in the Jewish faith, or is that kind of on the down low search?
Yes, so it's interesting. I hope you won't mind. I'll mention a book that I wrote because it is connected to this. I wrote a book called Enoch Rising, and it's the subtitle is En Meduranki. It's a hard, because it's a ancient name. Fallen angels and the rise of unlocking early Christianity. And what I did is I looked at the Enoch tradition, and I looked at it from a Jewish and a Christian perspective. And then I traced it from an ancient Akkadian source. And then I looked how it developed in early Christianity and early Judaism. So what's interesting is that, the book of Enoch is a Jewish text. It was found at Qumran, Aramaic fragments. And it was part of the views of many different Jewish groups in the Second Temple era. That's basically from 515 to 70 CE. So a very large amount of time. A lot of people were using it. Other books sort of assume that about the book of Enoch, because they'll mention things that are in it. And of course, even the New Testament, there's some reference to it. It sort of fell out of favor, I think, for several reasons. I think in the Talmud, in this key document in Judaism, where the oral law is essentially discussed, there are a lot of traditions that are kept. So it's not just legal matter. It's what we call agadic material. It's you could say folklore, legends, midrash, so forth. There are discussions about some of the angels that are mentioned in the book of Enoch, specific names that also relate to the ones in the Nephilim. And then there's also the issue of Enoch himself, because he's the key player. So in the early centuries of the Common Era, so we're talking about like the second and third centuries, it seems to have fallen out of favor. Maybe it was because Christians had adopted that, and it's sometimes it seems like Jews and Christians have like a seesaw kind of relationship. When Jews see Christians doing something, they don't want to do that anymore, and then time passes and it becomes like the opposite thing. In fact, this might give you sort of a good like a side note. Last week there was the Torah portion. We read it like on a weekly basis, and it had the part where Pharaoh asked Moses to stop the plague of hail. And then it says that Moses went outside of the city and he spread his hands and he asked God to stop the plague. The practice of spreading the hands it's a very Jewish thing, but we don't really do that anymore. And one of the discussions I was having as I was teaching on that was that it probably was a reaction to Christians having adopted that. And then you had all these non-Jewish individuals that were doing this Jewish thing, and it made sort of Christian Jews like feel uncomfortable. And it's the same thing like with the Nephilim and Enoch. I think as Christians adopted that idea, it fell out of favor among Jewish circles. But then in the medieval period, it comes back up. It's almost like they brought it back. They borrowed it back from Christians, even though it was originally from Jewish sources. So you see some reference to it. There's a very famous commentary called Me'am Lo'ez, and it talks about the angels coming down and teaching women about cosmetics and magic and all the things that happen in the Book of Enoch. It's just not a major focus for most Jewish groups. There are some rabbis on YouTube that do focus on that, and many times they sound very, I guess you could say almost Christian, because they talk about what you talk, the end times and one world governments and things of that nature. But I think for the most part, it's not really something that most Jews talk about. And I think part of it is maybe that, again, people have unfortunately seen it as like a Christian thing, but it's a very Jewish thing. And that's one of the things I sort of focus in on, is sort of bringing back some of those ideas back, for Jews to think about them. A few months ago, I taught a seminar called Reclaiming Enoch. And I basically talked about that. These are Jewish ideas, and we sort of allow external forces to take them away from us, when we should be saying, hey, this is part of the Jewish tradition. Let's talk about it. And of course, there are many Christians that I've listened to, Coast to Coast, I know has a lot of people on and those kind of shows that they talk about that kind of stuff. I think it's fascinating, but I can't say like there's a definitive view on it. I think there's just, different opinions and different commentators that have talked about that.
Gotcha. So one thing, and we know we've kept you for a while, but we'd be remiss if we didn't ask you about this last thing. So you've been a speaker about, and you've studied Crypto-Judaic studies. Can you give us kind of a 30,000-foot view of what Crypto-Judaic studies is?
Yes. So it gets back to the history of Jews in Spain and Portugal. So just very quickly, in the medieval period, the community in the Iberian Peninsula was the largest Jewish community in Europe. Most people don't know that. And then through a series of events, about a third of the Jewish community was forced to convert to Christianity. There were riots and there were attacks. And so one way to survive was to become a Catholic. And what happened is, for more than 100 years, in fact, sometimes several hundred years, these individuals lived a dual life. They would go to church and they would have their children baptized, but at home, they might wash away the baptism with wine. They might say Jewish prayers. They might donate to the synagogue. They might participate in the synagogue. They might, all the things that you think about Jewishly, they would transmit these secretly. So this is where the word crypto, we're not talking about currency, but they would do so secretly. And they maintained this dual identity for a very long period of time. And the reason that they had to do that is because eventually the Inquisition would say, if you were a Christian, even though you were a Jew, maybe a minute ago, if we catch you still practicing Jewish observances, we are going to call you a heretic. We're going to designate you as a heretic, and then you're going to be subject to, imprisonment, penalties. If you don't behave and you relapse again, you might be burnt at the stake. And so for a very long period of time, these individuals live this secret life. And so one of the books that I wrote was called Secret Jews. And then the subtitle was The Complex Identity of Crypto-Jews and Crypto-Judaism. And these crypto-Jews, they spread out throughout Europe, into the Americas, even in the conquistadors, like with Cortez. They spread out throughout the world, and sometimes they retained both elements, and sometimes they combined these elements. They didn't know exactly where the Jewish and the Christian part ended. They sort of fused them and created like a new identity. But they were able to keep that and transmit that in a certain form to their children, their grandchildren, and even today, you know, hundreds of years later, there are people who say, "Oh yeah, my grandfather, before he passed, told me that we have a family secret. You know, we went to church, but he just told me that my ancestors were Jewish, and I don't know what to do with that." And so I have those kind of conversations with people, and it happens quite often. And it happened on the Portuguese side as well. And I mean, it's really an amazing story in many ways.
Now, my last question really to you is based upon a very common search result I got back when I was looking up Jewish conspiracy theories, Jewish stereotypes, and a couple of phrases which came up quite frequently were Jewish occultism and Jewish mysticism. Now, obviously, the nature of religion introduces a supernatural aspect to the entire entity, and within the New Testament, it talks about the disciples thinking Jesus was a ghost when he was walking on the water. So there's obviously a belief in ghosts and spirits in the Jewish religion, but is that completely separate to all that stuff on the internet? Because I'll be honest with you, I didn't want to click on any of the links and have any of that stuff in my search engine, but it was something which kept coming up quite frequently about Jewish occultism, Jewish mysticism. Can you explain exactly what that is, rather than people just clicking on links and reading absolute garbage?
Yeah, so the idea, I mean, mysticism in a very simple form, the word mystikos is Greek. It simply means a person, closing their eyes and concentrating. So you think about many people today, they'll close their eyes when they pray, right? Sort of out of reverence or just to focus in. That's a mystical experience on a very simple level, right? It's something that is sort of it's physical, but it's not normal, right? It's something that sort of focuses in on another dimension. So when you look at the Bible, you have what you can call mystical experiences, like the prophets. They have visions. They have almost like a trance-like experience. They see things. They communicate with God, especially like the book of Ezekiel. I mean, the wheels and all the things that he sees. This is like the basis for Jewish mysticism. I'm sure you've heard the term Kabbalah or Kabbalah. This is like the primary text, and what you see in the Second Temple period, that hundreds of years between the destruction of the First Temple and the end of the temple in 70 CE, is you see these mystical elements develop. You see it at Qumran. They have like demonology, the demons. I mean, you find that in the New Testament, right? In the Hebrew Bible, there's not a lot of discussion about that. You have some references that talk about demons. It's really in the New Testament where they're all over the place. But that didn't happen like out of thin air. There was like a background for that idea. And so when it comes to angels, angelology, warding off spirits, that's all the domain of the mystical or the occult. And occult has like this sense of evilness or something like that, but it just means something that is hidden, right? It's something that is not open or transparent. So throughout time, there's been a development of a Jewish mystical approach to biblical text. Like, what is the surface reading of the text, and what is the more deeper meaning? What is the hidden meaning? And so that has developed into different schools of Jewish thought. And as time progressed, some of those had a dimension that was what we would call like practical mysticism. And that would be, does the name of God, or do the Hebrew letters, for example, have, I don't like using the term because it sort of has certain connotations, but do they have like a magical aspect to them? God speaks and the world is formed. He doesn't, really use his hands per se. It's something mysterious and powerful about the words that are spoken. And so you find these different trends in the medieval period, and they develop into what we call Kabbalah and in different texts that interpret the Bible. And interestingly enough, when you get to like the Renaissance period in the 1500s and 1600s, there are many Christians who actually become interested in Kabbalistic texts. And there's something that's called Christian Kabbalah. And it's this Christianized form of these Jewish texts, and you can find it like among the Rosicrucians and certain elements of I think like Masons and so forth. So it branches off like into a different area, but there are aspects of what people call practical Kabbalah that would be sort of in the domain of that occultic aspect. That's not something that I promote. The tradition that we have is a very rational tradition, and many of the Jews in Spain were very influenced by the Islamic tradition in the sense of they were philosophers, Aristotelian and that kind of. So our tendency is we're not so much into that, but there are streams of Jewish thought that are very mystical in that sense. What is on the internet, I think, is often a fusion of many disparate views, and sometimes they're accurate, and sometimes they equate it with black magic and all kinds of things of that. And of course, magic is prohibited by the Torah. I mean, it's something that is one of the key prohibitions. Sorcery is not permitted, and so I think there's a recognition of its power, but it's prohibited to the people of Israel, and that I think is very clear in Torah.
Gotcha. So before we let you sign off and let you tell everybody how to find out about you, we have a kind of tradition we've done on this podcast forever. We're always in search of our next sponsor. And we do not have a Jewish restaurant sponsor. So can you tell us what your favorite Jewish restaurant is in Dallas? And then maybe they will become our Jewish restaurant sponsor.
Let me think.
And by the way, as you're thinking, not only tell us what your favorite Jewish restaurant is, but what your favorite dish at that Jewish restaurant is. So when we actually decide to leave our little hub over here in Fort Worth and make ourselves over to the horrible part of the Metroplex, let's be honest. I mean, Fort Worth is great. That side of the Metroplex we're not big fans of, but maybe if we find ourselves over there, we're going to show up to this Jewish restaurant and have this dish. So we're going to we're putting you on the spot here. What's your favorite Jewish restaurant? And when we go there, what are we supposed to order?
Well, the place is Meat Point, so that's right up your alley. Meat Point.
I already like the sound of this. Yes,
it's in Richardson. It's run by Israelis. I would say that it's been a long time since I've been there, but I think they had schnitzel of all things. So I'm a big fan of schnitzel.
I love schnitzel.
But it's very Israeli, a lot of Mediterranean type stuff. But they have burgers and things of that nature. But Meat Point is probably the nicest and the best restaurant that we have to offer in this area. So.
All right, so Meat Point. If you are listening to this podcast, we do not have a Jewish restaurant sponsor yet, and we would love for you to be our sponsor. So we will show up there. So Juan, we appreciate the time that you've taken out of your day to chat with us about all this. It's been very fascinating. So can you tell everybody how they can find you, social media, your books, all that good stuff? Give yourself a good long commercial here of how people can find out more about you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. So my main website is modern, MODERN - scribe, SCRIBE.com. And then Amazon, if you type my name in, there's an author page. I've got something like 35 books of different sizes. Some are 50 pages, some are hundreds of pages long, on almost every topic that I've covered and many more. I do have a Facebook fan page. It's my name, Juan Marcos Bejarano Gutierrez. And those are really the ways to contact me. And if I don't know if you recommend giving out emails or not, but if you,
that's your call.
Okay, I'm happy to do so. It's R as in Robert, A as in Apple, M as in Mary, B as in boy, A as in Apple, M as in Mary, 44@gmail.com. So it's Rambam or Rambam 44@gmail.com. And I'm happy to engage with any questions. If they're in their area, I'm even happy to meet with people at Starbucks. I mean, it's exciting for me. I like to talk to people about Jewish things. I like to talk to people who are Christians, further that discussion, the good relations. And I'm always open to more discussions and anything that I can be of service with.
Well, fantastic. Rabbi, we certainly appreciate you taking this time out of your day to talk with us, and please check out his books. 35 books written I don't think I've even read 35 books, so good on you. Appreciate that. For those of y'all that are watching on YouTube, please go ahead and click our logo and subscribe to our channel. We'd appreciate that, and that will do that for this episode of The Wolf and the Shepherd, and we will catch you on the next one.